Welcome everyone to Teaching Race and Material Culture in the Ancient Mediterranean, the second of 3 webinars sponsored by the Archaeological Institute of America, the AIA, and organized by the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Subcommittee. As the title indicates, this webinar will deal with teaching strategies for those of us who work in the Ancient Mediterranean, focusing specifically on teaching situated at the intersection of art and archaeology and race and identity. The third and final webinar in this series is entitled Becoming Better Accomplices and Instructors, Justice, Activism, and Reflexivity in Teaching Museums and Cultural Heritage, and is scheduled for Thursday, August 27th, 3:30 p.m. Eastern. So that's a week from tomorrow. Before I introduce our speakers, let me add a little bit of context. The AIA's Vice President for Research and Academic Affairs, Tom Tartarin, initially proposed a subcommittee on diversity for the AIA in 2019. And the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and others, and the protests of their murders that followed, prompted our committee to reflect on what immediate actions we could take as academics and as archaeologists. And our teaching practices seemed like one good place to start. So these webinars represent the result of those initial discussions. And let me emphasize that our committee understands this as the first step, and a small step at that, but a first step of a larger process of much needed diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And in fact, this work isn't limited to our committee, but is really something that's happening across the AIA. And I want to thank the leadership of the AIA, and especially the president, Letitia LaFollette, for her strong support of these initiatives. So our goal today is to talk about our experiences teaching and learning about race and antiquity with an emphasis on the role of material culture. We'll talk about the makeup of our classes and how that affects our teaching, how we incorporate current events, the limitations and traps of current approaches, teaching in the time of COVID, and the successes and failures that we've experienced along the way. And finally, I want to point backwards and forwards. I would suggest that you all watch, if you haven't already, Archaeology in the Time of Black Lives Matter, a webinar that was sponsored by the Society of Black Archaeologists, the Columbia Center for Archaeology, and TAG North America. So that's backwards. Forwards, 1 week from today, our colleagues Jackie Murray and Rebecca Futo-Kennedy will be discussing their experiences teaching about race and ethnicity in the Greco-Roman world. And for that, you should go to everydayorientalism.wordpress.com for more information about that webinar. And like I said already, the first webinar in this series was recorded and is online now. Likewise, this webinar will be recorded and posted online with extensive show notes, with links and references. So we'll try to answer as much as we can in the Q&A in real time, but we'll also circle back around and get some stuff down for you, resources and so on. Okay, so much for the introduction. And in the interest of time, I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers, and then we'll get into the meat of the discussion. So Maggie Beeler is an adjunct professor in Greek and Roman classics and art history at Temple University. Her research and teaching center on issues of social identity, hierarchy, and collective action in Greek antiquity. She teaches multiple sections of race in the ancient Mediterranean each semester, a course that fulfills the race and diversity requirement for Temple's general education program. Bethany Hucks is a third-year PhD candidate at Heidelberg University, working on how ancient Romans used and perceived ideas and images from Egypt during the imperial period, and reconstructing object assemblages using a database and 3D models to recreate complex contexts. She's excavated in 4 countries, specializing in stone materials and pottery, and she has a background in biochemistry, financial marketing, and museum studies. She also works on issues of diversity, equity, and accessibility in archaeology and ancient Mediterranean studies. Patricia Kim is assistant professor and faculty fellow at the Gallatin School of Individualized Study and a provost postdoctoral fellow at New York University. Her research, teaching, and curatorial projects explore questions of gender, power, and memory in the ancient world and the present. She's writing a book on the visual and material culture of queenship in the Hellenistic world. She also serves as assistant curator and communications director at Monument Lab. Nisha McSweeney is currently professor in the School of Archaeology and Ancient History at the University of Leicester, but will be taking up the chair of Greek archaeology at the University of Vienna in October. Congratulations. She works on the Iron Age to classical Greek world and Anatolia, and directs an archaeological survey in Cilicia. Lindsey Mazurek is assistant professor of classical studies at Indiana University, Bloomington, I should say. Her research focuses on issues of race, migration, imperialism, and appropriation through material culture in the Roman Empire. She also co-directs a digital history and archaeology project, the Mediterranean Connectivity Initiative, focused on local and trans-Mediterranean social networking. Finally, I, Dimitri Nakassis, am professor in the Department of Classics at the University of Colorado Boulder. My research focuses on the late Bronze Age of Greece, and I'm the co-director, I should say, of the Western Argolid Regional Project, an archaeological survey. For the past several years, I've also regularly taught a class on race and antiquity. So before we begin in earnest, I'd like to ask our presenters if there's anything that they'd like to add about themselves, and then we'll get into the questions. Maggie, did you want to go first?
Not really. I think that I'll be addressing sort of my positionality in that for those who can't see the screen for accessibility reasons, I am a white instructor and I teach a more diverse classroom. So I'll be addressing that in my question, but I just want to flag that that's who I am.
Great. Beth, did you want to go next?
Sure. So I am a mixed race Black woman. I was raised and did my undergraduate in the US on both coasts. And now I did my master's in Italy and I'm doing my PhD between Germany and Italy. So I've come at this from a fairly international perspective of what it is to be a minority culture from several perspectives, as a woman, as a Black woman, and as a disabled woman.
Trisha?
Hi, everyone. I'm Patricia Kim. I identify as a Korean woman and a woman of color. Today, that's how I'm identifying. And my pronouns are she, her, hers.
Nisha?
Yes, hello. So my positionality is I am biracial, white, yellow, and I'm racialized differently in different contexts. So take your pick.
Lenny?
Hello, everyone. I am Lindsey Mazurek, and I am white. And for a long time, I thought that maybe that was something that I shouldn't think about or shouldn't talk too much about because it seems sometimes irrelevant when we talk about this. But I think the more I've gone on to look at the role of race and teaching race in the classroom, it's really important for those of us who are white to reckon with that and to forefront that. And that's something that I know Maggie is going to be talking about. And I think we'll all be coming back to, since this is a majority white field, I think it's important for all of us who are white to really come to terms with what that really means.
I can add that I've got a Greek father and a Filipino mother, both of whom were born outside the United States, so I'm second generation. But otherwise, I'm loaded with privilege. So I guess I can leave it there. Okay, great. So let's start with the first question that we prepared, which was how does one develop an entire standalone class that deals with issues of race and Mediterranean material culture? And perhaps we could start with Maggie, since that's one of the things she does at Temple.
Sure. So as I mentioned, and I belabored in my introduction, that I'm an adjunct professor at Temple University. And I say that because I wind up teaching multiple sections of the Race in the Ancient Mediterranean course every semester, which is to say I push a high volume of students through a very complex topic, and almost none of them are classics or archaeology majors. So I wanted to share with you today just a couple of the resources that I use and some of the teaching strategies for doing so, because it's a really complex topic. As you know, it could be challenging, especially for students who are not accustomed to discussing race. But again, my class, it's taught through the Greek and Roman Classics department at Temple, and it satisfies the race and diversity requirement for the core curriculum for Temple's Gen Ed. So if you're a performance major, if you are a business major, you're coming through my class. So I have to teach them how to look at ancient texts and ancient artifacts and ancient archaeology, in addition to what is race, what is ethnicity, what is its modern legal history, how do you connect it through 19th century pseudoscience all the way back to Plato and to the archaeology of it. So here are the two resources that I use that really structure my class. And I feel like I'm doing a YouTube unboxing video a little bit, but here you go. This is essential. This is an anthology of Greek and Roman translated texts. It's Race and Ethnicity in the Classical World, an anthology of primary sources and translation. It's edited by Rebecca Kennedy, who was on the webinar last week, and we will hear from again with Jackie Murray coming up, Sidnor Roy and Max Goldman. My understanding is that Sidnor Roy, although I've never met her, taught this class at Temple, and so I believe that I've inherited her hard work. So I'd like to give a special shout out to both her and to Rebecca Kennedy, who was incredibly generous with helping me to set up my class. So the way that the editors have structured this book, it goes through ancient theories of race. It starts with early theories. You look at Homer and Hesiod, and then it moves into foundation myths, genetic theories of race, environmental theories of race. So I actually made each one of those a different module or unit or week for my course. It then moves into people of the past, ancient people. So you look at Persians, you look at Africans, etc. So that provides a very good structure for setting up your course. The other text that I use for this course is a book by Dimitri Nakassis called Race, Antiquity, and Its Legacy. And this book is great because she confronts race head on. She doesn't sidestep it and deal with less combustible terms like ethnicity. She actually tackles it head on. So this is a great way to make the class relevant and impactful to students, to their real world, and a way to give them a framework and sort of a venue and a vocabulary to talk about race specifically as it informs their lives and also the way that it connects to the past. So with this, I assign sections from the relevant chapters. When she talks about environmental theories, we read that alongside On Airs, Waters, and Places, for example. So that's how you can structure your class in terms of the texts. I also supplement in there, weave in different readings, so that's where you can throw in Black feminist archaeology or post-colonial theory or critical race theory. We look at Orientalism and read Said the week that we look at Persians. We tackle Black Athena the week that we look at Africans. So there's any number of ways that you can weave in scholarly or popular sources into that. The other thing you need to do, we're talking about material culture, right? We're talking about archaeology. And so you can weave that in a really substantive way that isn't just illustrating myths with Greek painted pottery. So one quick example that I'll give you is when we're talking about genetic theories of race, we look at autochthony, right? So that's the Athenian myth that they're literally indigenous because their ancestor Erecthonius was born directly from the soil, and Gaia gave birth to him, and Athena received them as the nurse. So we do look at the ancient painted pottery representations of this, where Athena is sometimes shown in her full armor receiving Erecthonius when he's born, and she's sometimes shown without her armor in this sort of more virginal, maternal, however they're navigating this myth. But we also go up and look at the Erechtheion. We look at the architectural history of it. We look at its full context, and we go up on the Athenian Acropolis and do real archaeology and guide them through that. So that's the way that you can structure that. The other thing I would say is that I use archaeology almost as counter-narrative in my class, counter-narrative being the first tenet of critical race theory. And the way that I do that is, for instance, when we're reading what Herodotus has to say about Scythians, I look at the archaeology of the Scythians, and I'm not expert in Scythian archaeology, but the British Museum has a really excellent resource from it from their recent exhibition. So there are movies and there are images you can use for that. When we talk about Africans, for instance, there's a great PBS documentary that you can use to show your students. It's recent. It's Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s Africa's Great Civilizations. And the very first episode is an excellent introduction to archaeology, period, not just archaeology of Africa. So that's a great place to start. Those are a couple of the resources that I use for it. The other thing I will say is that Nakassis herself in this book provides a structure for introducing Black voices like Henry Louis Gates Jr. And the other great thing about that PBS documentary, I should say, is that it features mostly African archaeologists and scholars. So it's important for me, referring to my positionality, to decenter myself as a white instructor as much as possible. And I do that in large part by integrating multimedia, having these interviews or documentaries. And Nakassis' book starts each chapter with a quote from Angela Davis or James Baldwin or Toni Morrison. And so that in class for those lectures, I show interviews with those thinkers. And so it's important for me, as much as possible, to lecture only about the historical content and to tackle these larger questions by reading from other voices, trying to amplify marginalized voices. So that's, in short, how I structure everything and weave archaeology into my standalone class.
Our classes sound very similar, Maggie. I use the same 2 textbooks as well, and I find them very useful. Obviously, there's a lot of supplementation that does go on. I find Painter's History of White People to be useful introduction at the beginning. We do read a lot of Snowden, which is interesting to see the students respond to Snowden, especially because a lot of the stuff Snowden wrote is a bit older. So the language he uses is very off-putting to some students. So that's interesting to see them respond to that. And then I also end up talking quite a bit about the Fayum portraits. I don't know if that's something that comes up a lot in your classes, as a way just to like, as a kind of not database is not the right word, as a kind of collection of ancient faces for them just to kind of flip through and respond to. That seems to me to be a useful exercise. One thing I can maybe add just briefly, and then I'll be quiet, is that my impression is that when I first started, I was putting too much stuff in the class, and in iterations, I've started to pare it down. In initial iterations, I was very concerned to get kind of even balance between Greek and Roman topics, but the class has become more Hellenic as it's evolved, in part just because that's my main interest, and it's a way of simplifying the course. I've also tried to add more, I've tried to decenter the Greco-Roman position a bit. So talking more about, well, what does ethnicity or race look like from an Egyptian perspective, from an ancient Egyptian perspective? What does it look like from an ancient Persian perspective? Because that was something that, especially in the first iteration of the class, it was so focalized through Greek and Roman texts, and students kept asking me, well, what about other ancient cultures in the Mediterranean? Well, how are they responding to these? So that's one way I think of doing it. Eric Gruen has some interesting articles about this sort of thing, and it's very interesting to see the students respond to Gruen. They're very critical, I would say, of Gruen. So so that those kinds of readings, as problematic as they can sometimes be, are great ways to open the class up for discussion. At least that's my experience. Does anyone want to respond to what Maggie and I have been talking, or Maggie, do you want to respond to my nonsense?
Dimitri, there's a question actually in the Q&A that perhaps you and Maggie could talk about. So Jen Thumb wants to know if you could say a little bit more about having students look at the faces of the Fayum portraits. Are they looking at them in the context of online museum collections, online exhibitions, or in books, that kind of thing?
Yeah, for me, it's books. That's the best way for them to access it. So it's hardly unproblematic. One thing that I've thought about with my students, I was very worried when I first started teaching the class that I would get the responses of the students would be very, I don't know, simple is not the right word, but I find my students are very sophisticated readers of ancient texts, right? They, at least in my experience here at CU, which is a majority white, it's a very white institution. My students tend to be more diverse than the institution as a whole in this particular class. They're very sophisticated readers of these texts. A lot of them have taken classes in ethnic studies or classes that have a significant critical race theory component, and so in that way they're much more sophisticated readers in some ways than I am of texts that I know very well. So so as decontextualized as the Fayum portraits are, I feel like the students are aware of the way that they've been decontextualized. I mean, we talk about it in class, and so they're good response. They take that into account when they're looking at the material as much as they can, I think. Sorry, go ahead, Bet.
I also just wanted to add that, especially at the undergraduate level, when we're talking about race and ethnicity in terms of like the Fayum portraits and showing statues and vases and all of these other kinds of material culture that demonstrates the different colors and facial characteristics of people, we need to emphasize to our students that this doesn't actually necessarily express phenotype in any real way, and that phenotype has nothing to do with race necessarily in ancient world, and that language does not equal ethnicity. I think there's a lot of introduction of material culture that can be done very meaningfully and can be wonderful for students, but if we're not addressing those issues specifically, we're doing more to create a problem about how they view race in the ancient world as directly linked to race in the present world. And we need to make sure that that's something that our students are thinking about, that their own narratives and perspectives and ours as professors and grad students and sort of professionals in the field are always going to be skewed by our modern day upbringings and the places we live and the people we spend time around. And we need to be careful about looking at material culture from the ancient world using those points of view.
There's a question in the Q&A about balancing of lecture and discussion in this kind of course. Maggie, do you want to speak to that?
I'm actually going to be addressing that a little bit later in it, but I will say that the balance of lecture and group discussion is really important if you, again, are a white instructor, very conscious of your positionality. My classrooms are not predominantly white, and they're definitely not predominantly white female. So I integrate group discussions as a way to really flip the classroom and to legitimize students' lived experiences as students of color or disabled students or whatever their lived experiences are. They have a contribution to the conversation that I can't give. And it not only legitimizes those lived experiences as a source of authority in the classroom, it exposes the students to all different types of perspectives. And so that's really important to me. I used to do discussions every week, but I have pared it down. As Dimitri said, you find that you're doing too much initially. And so I've been teaching this class every semester since 2017. And I've pared it down now to just the essential. I think I have 7 or 8 structured group lectures, and teaching the class remotely by Zoom. Those are our Zoom meetings. I teach asynchronously with the lectures, and that's how I deliver the historical course content. And then we tackle the issues together as a group. And I'm going to speak more on that later on when I talk about how to integrate current events into the classroom. I think I just gave away the plot, but there you go.
I agree that discussion is absolutely critical in these classes, especially when they're general classes that are generally not populated by majors, because the students learn a ton from each other. I learn a lot from the students. They all bring very different perspectives, and they learn a lot about the ancient world along the way. I mean, that was the one thing that, I don't know if it surprised me, but maybe a little surprised me, was how much material we got through. So much content, more than was really easily digestible, which is why I started to pare things down a little bit and kind of focus on the triad of Greece, Persia, and Egypt. But yeah, these classes can be very content rich, even if they're driven by discussion. At least that's been my experience. Okay, maybe we should move on. We're almost 30 minutes in. So I will circle around to some of these questions, I'm sure, in the discussion that follows. So the second question was about developing modules that address race in classes, or thread discussions of race into classes that are nominally about other things. Linny, you wanted to start us off on this discussion.
Yes, thank you. So I recently moved institutions. I just came to IU from the University of Oregon, where I was in the history department. And one of my tasks when I started that job was to teach Western Civ. And I know many of you in this webinar are probably assigned a class like that you probably didn't put on the books, but it's been there forever, and now it's part of your job to deal with it. So I had to, as part of that, part of my job, figure out how I was going to teach this class and make this class work, given that I, A, don't agree with the general concept of Western Civ, B, really am very interested in these questions of race and ethnicity and antiquity, and wanted also to create a really good introductory course for students who were new to college, maybe didn't have a lot of background to know what to expect, and wanted to give them a great skills education and also introduce them to the diversity of the ancient Mediterranean. So what did I do? The first thing I did when I got this job, and I say this, I have to preface this, that I was able to do this because I was in a very supportive department, is I put in paperwork to change the name. That's actually usually easier than completely pulling a course off of the books. And with a course like that, that's History 101, Classics 101, oftentimes you actually don't want to pull that number off of the books because transfer students are given credit based on equivalency. So if you pull History 101 off the books, that means students who are transferring in from community college actually can't get credit. So that's something to think about if you are looking to make a major change in your curriculum. So what we did was we changed the name, and we changed it to Ancient Mediterranean. Every institution has weird stuff about changing names. Mine had to be under 18 characters long. But I want to just sort of put forth this idea that just changing the name of your course on the books in terms of the things that students see when they click on the registrar's website can make such a huge difference. It wasn't as though my predecessors and my colleagues at Oregon had been teaching a traditional Western Civ class. It's actually not what was going on, but just changing the name, I taught it twice. The first time that class was extremely white. It was also a group of students who were marginally interested in the topic at best. The next year, my diversity completely changed. I had students of color in that class, and I have to reiterate, Oregon is a primarily white serving institution. I mean primarily white. It's a very white school. And so the level of diversity I was able to get in that class simply by changing the name was great. And that's really beneficial for me as an instructor because I get so many different perspectives. And it also draws a lot of students into our department who can learn, hopefully pursue history and pursue history into other areas, and also really just really changed the way that we talk about antiquity. The other thing I did is I adopted a new textbook. I used Ralph Matheson's Ancient Mediterranean Civilizations. It's not perfect, no textbook ever is, but it does offer the benefit of going culture group by culture group. So I was able to sort of reorient it from going chronologically to orienting it more towards, here are these culture groups, and let's focus on the moments in which they come into contact with one another. I also pushed myself to increase the emphasis on the ancient Near East. So really making sure I spend the time on the Achaemenids, I spend the time on Mesopotamia, I spend the time on Egypt, which did mean working against my textbook in some ways. But that also is more prep work for me, and it's less in my wheelhouse. I'm trained as a classicist like many of us, so Greece and Rome is my wheelhouse. It's more work. And I also was able to then use the Matheson textbook, which comes with a primary source reader, to change the primary source readings that included more different voices from areas that I was less familiar with. So it has a lot of great passages, for example, from Mesopotamian cultures, from Egypt, as well as Islamic cultures, and also integrate my own primary sources to make sure that women were properly represented and we were able to talk about those issues. The other thing I did, and this is something I know a lot of people are concerned about, is how do you integrate race? If you're talking about cultural identity in your class, which you probably are, you're probably talking about race and you're just not ready to use the word. If you're talking about cultural conflict, cultural change, cultural pressures, we often, I think in our discussion, the panelists pointed out that we often use terms like culture or race or cultural identity to hide race, to hide the fact that that's what we're really talking about. So that can be one way to catch out and realize you're probably already doing some parts of this, and it's really about reorienting those discussions to be more explicitly about race. So what are the outcomes that I found? We're all in we all have to do metrics now. We all have to, pay attention to what our outcomes and our outputs are. So I would say that this approach really improves student learning. It's possible I drew a stronger group of students. I wasn't there long enough to sort of do a formal study, but the grades went up about 7% in the class that I called Ancient Mediterranean versus the one that was called Western Civ. I think that's because students were more motivated to attend, and they were more able to see the relevance of this material to their class by using this more explicit racial language. Students were able to say, this is something that I can see reflected in my own experience. This is something that I'm interested in. I can find a way to make this relevant to my own lives. It also helped me to, thinking about it this way also helped me streamline my lectures and really give a common thread throughout the course by really focusing in on the sense of cultural change and race. That gave my course a stronger narrative thread, because that course can be a real punch in the face of information. Now, whenever you change a course, there's, you have to take stuff out to put new stuff in. So what that meant is I did have to shorten the time span of the course. Dimitri, I'm so sorry, but I really jammed down on the Mycenaeans. They got 10 minutes. And I was a little bit sadder that I did have to cut off the time span at the end, so that meant I did discuss Islam a lot less. I was on the quarter system, so I had 10 weeks to go from, dawn of time to however far I could get. So I decided I wasn't going to go past basically the 8th or 9th century. There were some other negatives. Depending on how open you want to be about these kinds of changes. My chair at Oregon thought it was really important that we as a department take a real stand on these issues, and he was pretty open about these changes on Twitter. He took the heat for me. There's a lot of weird people who care so much about what is taught in the History 101 class at the University of Oregon, hundreds more than I ever thought cared. And my chair did get some pretty nasty tweets and some letters written to the president about how we were, ruining America. Luckily, the president of our university did not care. And I think that that's another thing to point out, is that I think a lot of universities would rather see these changes happen, especially in the current climate. So I want to wrap it up with a few sort of general approaches or takeaways that you all can think about as you try to revise your courses. One is, what is the concept of culture hiding in your course? What are words like culture and identity erasing from your discussions? The other suggestion I would have is to forefront moments where race is really relevant and name it very clearly. Give your students the space and to draw those parallels with their own lives. And this is really common pedagogical practices in other fields. Frankly, I think this is one of the reasons why we're losing students to other departments. We keep insisting on the historical particularism of these moments that we teach, and that's something that was brought up in the webinar last week. We keep insisting on the historical particularism, and we deny students the ability to identify with or connect with the material in that personal way. The last thing I want to suggest is, particularly for those of you who've been teaching for a long time, the idea of overhauling a course can be so daunting that maybe you just throw up your hands and say, I can't possibly do this. And what I would say there is, don't let the perfect become the enemy of the good. You don't need to become the world leading expert on ancient Mesopotamia to add a lecture on it. Read a handbook, chase down a couple of things that interest you. Take these baby steps. The other thing is, you can change your course over time. Maybe this year you fix 2 lectures and you introduce 1 new culture, and you keep working on it over the course of several years. Maybe you spend a little bit of time this summer working on a class and you workshop it with some friends. Feel free to just steal my syllabi, put your name on it, and teach the class. I'm granting everyone that permission. Just take the step. Take the first step, and it will, it will pay dividends in the end. All right, those are my thoughts.
Don't steal the work of junior scholars without attribution. It's the only thing I would add to that, especially junior scholars without attribution. There's some great questions in the Q&A that I wanted to highlight, and maybe, Linny, you could respond to this. How do you parse Mediterranean, African, European, Western, Asian, Near Eastern, however we want to call that? I mean, there's There's obviously good reasons not to Mediterraneanize Egypt, right? That was one of the questions about thinking of Egypt as an African civilization.
Yeah, I think that's one of those things that's so interesting. And again, I don't have a good answer for that, but I think it's really worth raising the question in class. So for example, one of the things I did was I had students read about Alexander the Great, and then there was a great passage, I'm sorry, the name of it is blanking, it is just coming blank, I'll put it in the show notes, of sort of a Persian perspective on Alexander's conquests, and asking my students, do you think the Persians really cared about Alexander? Is he an important figure? And getting students to think about, where does the Mediterranean stop? It's easy to use that as sort of a catch-all, and I needed something that had 18 characters or less. And so I think you can do things imperfectly, where you name something imperfectly, and then you can push on those definitions. And I think, from my perspective, I will probably call it ancient Mediterranean, but I do think, particularly in upper division courses, it's always a really good idea to say, where does Egypt belong? Where does Roman North Africa belong? Where does the Asian steppe belong in our cultural geographies? And what are the implications of sort of grouping different cultures with different regions?
My experience is that if you tell students ancient Egypt is an African civilization, you will get almost no pushback. I think that instinctively our students feel that way. Most of our students anyway, I should say. My partner teaches a class on Egypt, and that's one of the first things she says on the first day of classes, and students just nod, right? So in a way, I think we can do more damage than help in this regard. Nisha, yeah.
I think some of the problem may be from having the expectation that something is either Mediterranean or African, right? And those two things are not mutually exclusive. So being a Mediterranean culture does not mean it's not an African culture, and trying to destroy that kind of binary is part of, I think, what we're trying to do. So I mean, I wouldn't think that labeling, talking about the Mediterranean and beyond, maybe, or the Mediterranean and connected regions might be the way to do it. But hopefully we're trying not to put things into one box or another.
Beth, did you want to take this too?
Yes, given that I am actually an Egyptologist who works on Egyptian movement of pieces throughout the Mediterranean, I think about this a lot. And I think even on this panel, I've noticed that there's a tendency to just say Africa, and then to mention specific Near Eastern, Middle Eastern, West Asian cultures by name individually. And I think it's a problem of our field that even when we broaden where we're looking at, most of us look, if we're lucky, east or north, or even west as far as Spain and Portugal. Almost no one is looking in West Africa. If you just, one of these days I'm gonna get around to submitting for a project just to track little amulets dedicated to ISIS throughout the world, because they go as far as Mali, and they go as far as London, and they go as far as Germany, but they also go as far as India. So there is no real way to talk about this, because there's no way to talk about this without talking about differentiating Africa as well as we have differentiated these other cultural groups. Stuff doesn't travel in isolation. Stuff travels with people. People are mixing, people are hearing each other. And this is again what I mean by when I talk about language and phenotype not being expressive of cultural identity, and how people can have multiple cultural identities, especially, there was mixing of cultures going on also in the ancient world. So perhaps your father is from one culture and your mother is from another, and you just follow soldiers around for your early childhood. You're a third culture kid, even in the ancient Med or further afield. So I think that a lot of the way that we talk about it is still using these modern tropes from 1800s and after that have not really been interrogated in classical education specifically, when we sort of lump Africa into an unchanging, perpetual, unified culture. And that needs to be addressed when we're talking about Egypt as where it is in its place in the world.
1,000%. Yeah, 1,000%. Actually, and this is a great segue into another question that came up in the Q&A, which is what kind of readings do we think are especially good for disentangling modern and ancient concepts of race, ethnicity, identity?
So I put a suggestion in the book, in the answer. So I'll just reiterate that. I think that the McCoskey book that Maggie highlighted is a really good place, especially for undergraduate teaching. I think that that's a really good place to pull that out. One thing I also wanted to highlight is that, you know, if you're teaching race and ethnicity, your syllabus shouldn't just be white people. And, you know, just ground rule. So one of the things I have posted in the Q&A is a really great link that one of our panelists from last week, Nadira Hill, put together, which is a Black-centered resources for classics and ancient Mediterranean teaching. So, you know, you can go in there and find some great voices to add to your syllabus. For mine, I used Shelley Haley's work, and she does a really great job of sort of dealing with this problem and bringing her own voice to this question. But one of the things that actually ended up being, so this is one of those things where I kind of threw it out as a Hail Mary and didn't know how it was going to go, but it went amazingly. I actually had students read Emily Greenwood's book on the experience of classical education, particularly in the Caribbean, and its connections to racism and British imperialism. And I think the students really saw a lot about how they really got a lot out of that reading. And they really found that was one of those moments where I think that the particularism was able to kind of go out of the discussion. Students were able to see how there are lots of different ways to pick up classics and use it, both for good and for evil.
Bet, and then Tricia.
I also just wanted to add that the sources you're using now can be interrogated in ways that you maybe haven't been doing in your classroom previously. For instance, if you're teaching Herodotus as someone Greek only, that's a problem. He's being raised in modern day Turkey. If I, as an undergraduate, had realized that there were brown people writing history, it might have helped me realize that this narrative of like Herodotus is the father of Greek history and this continual narrative of white people as neutral moderators of history for other parts of the world is not accurate. And in fact, most of the people that I know who study classics don't interrogate Herodotus' position as a non-Greek peninsula-based person who may not have even been Greek presenting. So when you're talking to your students, especially your students of color, letting them know that there are valuable contributions, even in the ancient world, by people who come from sort of non-Greco-Roman sources that were taken seriously by their present day folk and have been taken seriously by people for the last 2,000 years, really makes a difference in the way we perceive ourselves and the way that we perceive the importance of non-Greco-Roman folk in the ancient world.
Tricia, did you want to say something too?
I just wanted to add a few sources that I found really helpful in teaching, but also in my own research, which is the medievalist Geraldine Hang's recent book. I think it came out in 2018. I'm forgetting the title, but her introduction is really great for explaining why it's so imperative that we not skip around or beat around the bush of race when we talk about pre-modern cultures. And this is something that I'll cover in, and this is something that I'll cover a little bit later in terms of the limitations and traps, but I think assigning articles and chapters from critical race theorists. So I know Omi and Wynant is a really big one that a lot of people, colleagues in our field use, but I think that it's important for us to do that work and even supplement the race and anthology or race and ethnicity anthology and so on with kind of rigorous critical race theory.
Omi and Wanan is a great way to get discussion going, although I also get the impression that many of my students have read that article in like all of their classes because it is so common. But I think it really unpacks nicely the process of racial formation, right? That race is always a historical process and needs to be historicized, right? And that's that and Ta-Nehisi's more journalistic writing is also really good, I think, for getting students to think about these issues. The other thing I was going to add to Bet's comment is that even modern Greeks weren't all that white until fairly recently, right? So So my grandfather was born in Asia Minor, Turkey. So, well,
and they still aren't in Europe.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And Mediterranean is a problematic category, as Michael Hertzfeld has talked about forever and ever. So yeah, all of our categories do bear this kind of difficult baggage, have this difficult baggage. Okay, we're way behind, which is great because the conversation I think has been very productive, but if it's okay with everybody, I'll move on to point number 3. Yeah? Okay, so the third question was about the makeup of our classes and how that makeup affects our teaching. Beth, did you want to start us off with this?
Sure. So obviously everybody knows that there's a dearth of people of color studying classics through most of the world. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how things that people do either subconsciously or consciously may be affecting your students of color and pushing them out, even though you might not realize it. And the first thing I wanted to talk about is that many of us from non-predominantly white cultures, including within this places like Canada and the US that are predominantly white, our subcultures have very different relationships with human remains than yours may. So one of the things that I found hugely problematic is walking into a museum and seeing human remains, but also they're on slideshows, your professor is showing you books, and there's no warning. And the relationship that my people have with human remains, especially in museums, is very problematic because most of those people, our ancestors, were murdered and then basically put on display for people's entertainment. So the way that I think about even people groups who are not in my people group, when I walk into a museum, I still feel that way about them. Like, how did they get there and why are they here? And where are their descendants? And do they have a voice in this kind of display? So your students will bring their lived experiences regardless of whether or not you think about what their lived experiences are. So just trying to be as thoughtful as possible when displaying remains, warning people in advance. And this is true of all grave goods, which is essentially what most museums, especially in the US, are made up of grave goods from various parts of the world. Grave goods are meant to be buried with a person. And when you take them away from the person, especially if you're talking in an Egyptian context, sometimes you're actually taking parts of the body in canopic jars and completely disassociating it from the original human remains. And that can be hugely problematic for many people. But I also wanted to say that if you are talking about race in the ancient world in your classroom and you are not advocating for your students of color and your colleagues of color in your actual department, you're not actually making a notable difference in their lives. They see that too. So they need to know that you're standing up for them. And a large part of that is not making them the arbiters to speak for their entire race when you're having class discussions. If you are having a class discussion and someone who is not a person of color says something in your class that's problematic, you should step in. Don't force your students of color to bear the burden of being like the spokesperson for their entire race. Remember that they are also taking this opportunity at university to learn and grow. And this should not be a stifling opportunity for them, but also they may have opinions that they've never interrogated before. And now they have to do it in public in front of their entire class in a way that their white peers are not expected to do. So if you're gonna do this kind of work, if you're gonna talk about race and ethnicity, if you need to practice in the mirror, if you need to practice with a friend, you can write me on Twitter, I'll practice with you over video chat. Just make sure that you have the practice stepping in to be a barrier, to not force your students of color to do yet more emotional labor to learn this. They're already doing the work to sign up for a class that says Western Civ and implies that their own cultures have brought nothing to world history. So what can you do? And acknowledging that there are gender and disability aspects that affect people of color more than that affect white people. If your classroom, if you're policing their bathroom time, if you're talking about they need to come to you with doctor's notes for very specific things, there are people of color who don't have access to that, and we often get denied doctors notes, and we often get denied. For instance, in COVID, there's a lot of talk about universities using testing where the camera is supposed to recognize eye tracking. It's problematic for autistic people who don't do eye contact anyway. It's problematic for facial recognition, which doesn't recognize Black faces. It means we have to turn on a super bright spotlight directly on our face in the middle of an exam. So if you're policing your students' behavior, you're pushing out your students of color. So there's a lot that can be done on a personal level, not just on an academic curriculum level, to make classrooms more, especially in these worlds, more welcoming to your students of color. And I also, on that note, wanted to talk about the Fayum portraits. When we were talking about them earlier, we were talking about them as a body that depicts, a group of people, but we need to talk about whom they are depicting, which is to say wealthier people who could afford this kind of material, who may or may not have been largely Hellenistic with some other influences. But also we know for a fact that things didn't change overnight. It's not like the Greeks showed up and everybody stopped having any melanin whatsoever. That's not reflected, however, in the Fayum portraits. So does that say something about the ease of painting with specific skin color? Does that say something about the wealth, since we know that traditional Egyptian portraiture used colors to indicate gender, etc. So what does it say about them, and how are we interrogating these sources instead of just implying, oh, well, it looks more naturalistic, therefore it's a very accurate self-portrait. So your students need to watch you work through these things, even if you don't have all the answers.
Great. I totally agree. I was actually thinking that that's a good segue to talk a little bit about resources for color in ancient art. I've found the work of Brekulaki useful, but maybe some others of you have other suggestions for ways to unpack color in Greek and Roman art and how to look at it.
This is kind of an odd take on it, but even just from a biochemical and geological perspective, there are limitations to what you can do given the pigments available in the ancient world. So one of the most interesting things for me was trying to recreate my own skin tone using things that would have been available. My skin tone changes dramatically from winter to summer, so this is a fun game throughout the year for me. But your students could see that, like, using that kind of methodology, that it is very difficult to actually reproduce real human skin tones without getting essentialistic. So something like that can be interesting because it's not as inaccessible to people who may have at least had an art class before, etc. So taking them into a museum, explaining about painted statuary and explaining about how replicating skin tone is a difficult process, explaining about patinas and how that changes over time, can be really interesting for your students to cause them to think differently about the way that they see skin depicted in the ancient world material sources.
Yeah, Brekulaki talks a lot about this stuff. It's really interesting. Sorry, Maggie, go ahead.
I have to dig up the resource and we'll put it up, but there's an excellent article by Zainab Bahrani that's a really just quick introduction to the fact that these are representations of race in Egyptian and in Mesopotamian art. And it's great. She focuses mostly on Mesopotamian Egypt, but it's wonderfully quick and digestible for your students. And she, it's Zainab Bahrani, so it's excellent with the theory and positionality and contextualizing everything. So I'll drop I have to dig it up, but I'll find that citation.
Okay, great. Anybody else want to respond to Bet's very thoughtful comments about the composition of classes and teaching? Tricia?
So I just want to note that my graduate degree was in an art history department, and so there were a wide variety of interests in different time periods in terms of our undergrad students. And I think one of the sort of biggest points of feedback that my department specifically received was that there was something that was very, let's say, off-putting about the kinds of language that some of our instructors would use, probably unknowingly. And I don't think that they meant to do this. They're not bad people, but sometimes when you introduce, I don't know, like you're teaching the Parthenon or something, right? Sometimes we say things as instructors like, you know, some of you may have gone to the Parthenon, or some of you may have seen this Monet, or some of you probably already know who Socrates is, I don't know, right? And just throwing out these names that we sort of expect our students to already come in with that knowledge. When, you know, I didn't grow up talking about the Parthenon when I was younger. And I think for a lot of students, for a lot of undergrads, to them, it makes them feel not included within these conversations. And it presents, I think, you know, one might say classist, right? There's something very classist about classics and art history, which makes sense historically. So I just wanted to follow up and echo a lot of what Beck was saying by just adding one of this very specific kind of feedback that I've heard for the past decade.
Go ahead, Nisha.
Yes, just to add on the makeup of your classrooms, I think it's absolutely crucially important, right? So we all started with our with our own positionality, and then our positionality in relation to our students changes depending on that body of students every time you walk into that classroom. And if I had one thing to say about that, from kind of making lots of mistakes myself in the past, was trying to rush in with discussions and expecting students to give of themselves and to give perspectives without building a relationship first and doing the hard work of building the relationship. Now, Bet talked about, as an instructor, stepping in with people. And I think that's crucial, because the ones who will talk most often, the most easily and the most freely, might be the ones who you might need to step in with a bit more. And sometimes those voices that you would want to encourage and you would want to be heard are the people who would feel less comfortable talking. So there's quite a long process of building out a relationship with students before getting into the classroom and engaging with topics which hopefully will make some of the students feel uncomfortable, because that's what you want to do. Before you get there, there's almost a kind of a backstory, a prequel of building up relationships in different ways by exposing yourself and as well to them, and letting them know that you've also made mistakes. And there's a whole series of things you can do to do that. But it's, for me, I think it's a difficult thing, and perhaps a problematic thing, to go in cold and just say, right, I expect you all to open up to me like this.
That's certainly been my experience too. Do you want to talk, is there anything else we should talk about, or should we move on to the next topic of conversation? So that is about incorporating current events into classroom discussions. Maggie, did you want to take the lead on this one?
Sure. I'll take the lead on that because, as I mentioned, I teach a gen ed. And so I have students who are coming in with no background, and I need to make this wonderfully complex, incredibly timely, and urgently necessary conversation digestible for them. And so I do integrate not just current events in terms of the news, but I also integrate modern conceptions of race. And this is a recurring thing that keeps coming up in this webinar. And one thing that I do is, in my before graduate school, I worked for an employment discrimination law firm specializing in sexual harassment and pregnancy discrimination. And so I used to make my students read the EEOC handbook, where they talk about race and color discrimination, the difference between race, color, and ethnicity. Now I default more to the Encyclopedia of Race, and we look at what is race in terms of its modern legal definition. And to look at the race history, I use the US Census. They have a lot of great digital tools, free tools on their website. I do make them sort of a table, and we go through and we track the different racial categories that are changing even now, as to kind of think about race in its historical context. And then I sort of structure my class by moving back in time, because we start with the modern legal definitions. We look at craniometry and race pseudoscience. I'm in Philadelphia. I'm right down the street from the Penn Museum, where the Morton collection has just been taken down from display. And so I sort of move back in time from there as we look at, how was whiteness invented? How was race invented to justify then the existing colonial setter, white supremacist social order and transatlantic slavery. And so I kind of throw a lot of critical history at them right away. Not necessarily theoretical, but I use a lot of the free resources that are available online. I love PBS documentaries. There's one called Race, the Power of an Illusion that does a really good job. The second one, The Story We Tell, talks about how race is a narrative. And I introduce this idea of narrative immediately. And it starts the conversation that I continue, as I mentioned, with group discussion. So I want to talk first about why you should integrate current events and the modern stuff, and then I'll give you 2 teaching strategies, one of which I've already shown you. But I think that, in short, the reason that we need to talk about current events is the same reason that we need to be bothering to have this conversation at all about race, which is that it's urgently needed. Look around us. In this time of intensifying anti-Black and anti-Indigenous discrimination, we owe it to our students, it's ethical pedagogy, to have this discussion explicitly in very no uncertain terms. And as to follow up on Bet's point before, what happens when you don't, as a white instructor, again, referring to my positionality, talk about race explicitly, even if your class isn't about race, is that you put the onus on your students of color, and particularly Black female students of color have this intersection where they're disproportionately burdened with raising these questions, pointing out the power dynamics of race in their classroom, in the material under study, in their own lives. And so you need to be doing that yourself. Again, I belabor the fact that I'm an adjunct because I really have no institutional power at all. As wonderful as the faculty and my chair especially are in my department to me, the only domain of action that I have is my classroom. And so I'm very intense about the way that I've structured everything. To bring current events into the classroom, you shouldn't shy away from doing it. Following up on what Linny said, that you need to take the first step. You need to integrate current events into your classroom, and there's a way that you can do it that is very structured and easy, and it's not terribly politicized. And that's to start the conversation with Charlottesville. Bear with me. That's because at Charlottesville, the deadly protest in Charlottesville, which was almost exactly 3 years ago today, it happened right before I started teaching this class. And so it very much informed the way that I wanted to go about teaching it. And at Charlottesville, you had white supremacist extremist groups there like Identity Europa. And Identity Europa is one that I look at a lot in my class because they're a white supremacist group that takes very seriously this idea of Western civilization and European cultural supremacy. If they're trying to intellectualize white supremacy is the long and short of it. And so when you start by looking at how they misappropriate the classical tradition, they have campus recruiting posters for their white supremacist group that they hang up at Temple. They weren't specifically the group that hung up posters in 2017. It was another group. There are a lot of them. But I talk about Identity Europa because they have one campus recruiting poster that has a photo of the Apollo Belvedere on it with the phrase, our future, what is it again? Our future belongs to us, which is obviously a reference to the 14 words, which is a white supremacist slogan. And they use the Apollo Belvedere not just because it's a great example of classical antiquity. It's a statue that's familiar to us, and it's almost shorthand, visual shorthand for Western. They also use it because the early race pseudosciences I was talking about before, like Morton, used the Apollo Belvedere as the model to measure with craniometry, a completely debunked race science, the perfection of European/white intelligence and beauty. That was the standard. So it's an intentional thing that they're doing. So you can start by looking at, here is an example in the news that is timely and relevant. It's also pretty shocking, so it engages students and they walk into the class thinking, wait, why are we talking about white supremacy on day one? It's something that you need to be doing. And if you talk about them, you also in the same class can talk about the controversy with ancient skin color and sculpture with Sarah Bond. You can talk about the fact that right before Charlottesville in June and July, Sarah Bond and Mary Beard, 2 female Roman historians, classicists, were harassed online by the same kind of groups that showed up to Charlottesville, by these white supremacists who are very much concerned, as Linny experienced, very, very, very concerned with Western. And it's just a coincidence that it's not at all part of their supremacist narrative. So I lead with those 2 things in the beginning. The Sarah Bond controversy, there are resources for that. There are 2 great articles that you can read by McCoskey and Kennedy that talk about it. Vice Media also has an interview with her to, again, use diversifying your instructional materials, so not just readings, also using videos. It's another way to reach all kinds of different learners and to make it impactful. So you can introduce that. And then that's the only thing you talk about in current events in terms of your lectures. That's it. Those are the only two things. They're directly relevant. They show how race and antiquity impacts and is relevant to the lives of your students. And then you use, and here we're jumping into the teaching strategies, group discussions. Group discussions is where you encourage students to bring in news. And since I've been teaching this class every semester since 2017, there's new white nationalist terrorism, there's races in the news every single day. And so there's always an opportunity for students to bring that in. But because I'm teaching these large classes, here's what I do with the group discussions to make them better. I break the students down into groups of 5, no more than 5, and they rotate throughout the semester so that they're exposed to a diversity of perspectives. And that's because students often won't feel comfortable necessarily, as Nisha was saying, if you haven't built the trust or the rapport with them, they're not going to start spilling guts about their experiences with race and racism, certainly not in a large class of 45 students. So if you break them down into these smaller groups, they have the opportunity to have these more intimate conversations, and you're not really refereeing them. You're sort of walking around and available to them. This is a pretty standard, active learning is something that we're all familiar with. That's not that groundbreaking, but it's really important because it provides this space for counter-narrative and a venue to bring current events into the classroom where you are not responsible for answering what can easily become political questions. So this is a structured way to introduce current events into your classroom. The other thing that I would say about that is what you're trying to do as an instructor is facilitate productive conversations. You are trying to get students to make the connections themselves. And so it all comes back to creating an inclusive learning environment, which Tricia gave us some really good recommendations for. The language that you use is really important for that. I want to really quickly share an exercise that I do at the beginning of every class, and not just this class, for other classes that I teach too, which is to use audience engagement software like Poll Everywhere. It's free for, I think, 30 students. You may have to pay a subscription for it, but it's free to the students completely. They don't have to pay a dime for it. And I do something called the identity exercise. Again, I have a gen ed class, so we look at the diversity in the classroom. And I don't mean racial and ethnic diversity. We look at their different academic majors. And then I say, okay, what do STEM majors bring to a conversation about race? What can humanity, what are our strengths? And this is something that we return to. And then the final question that I ask in this live poll, it displays the results on the screen, is I ask them to give me one word that describes their identity that is not their gender, their race, their ethnicity, their cultural background, their national origin, nothing intrinsic or inherent about them or even assigned to them, but how do they identify? And it's always, I'm an artist, I'm a musician, I'm a writer. And these are things you do. So it's a way to say identity is a verb. And this is a way to start the conversation about social construct while you're also introducing students to each other and establishing what your classroom community is like, and that it's a diverse community, and that each one of us is bringing a different sort of perspective to it as a whole classroom and then also as a small group. So that again is live polling through Poll Everywhere, which is a software that you can get for free. And I just think that that's a great way to sort of break the ice and get students talking. So again, starting with the misappropriation of classical tradition, talking about the ancient skin color, how we weren't white and how white marble models white supremacy, the controversy with the online harassment. If you bring in social media into your classroom, it makes you conversant with your students. You don't need to know, I got completely schooled by my students because I didn't know that Logic was a rapper. And I got really excited that we wanted to talk about Logic. And so there are ways that you can keep yourself conversant with your students by asking them. My students to this day, who I had in classes 3 years ago, still send me memes, because one of the things I like to do as an icebreaker for at the beginning of class is show different memes or music videos. If you make students part of the conversation, they feel invested in it, and they're going to want to show up and to talk about these things. So there are just little things that you can do that are practical recommendations for that. And so that's what I think bringing current events is not as scary as it could be if you structure it properly.
Thanks, Maggie. Do you think that these strategies would also work in an online environment? I know I'm anticipating some discussions further down the line, but it came up in one of the Q&A questions, and I thought it might be worth addressing here.
Yeah, Zoom breakout rooms are what I'm doing. It is obviously everything is less effective online with these conversations because people, stop and start. But that's why it's so critical to have these smaller groups, because 5 students, you can jump into the breakout rooms and see how things are going. I also have students post video introductions if they're willing, if they're comfortable with posting a video of themselves. And I try to tell them to do it kind of TikTok style. Sometimes they dance, mostly not. So it's a way to sort of build classroom community online, using multimedia as best as you can and emphasizing personal narrative.
Thanks, that's great. Any responses to, my experience is very similar to Maggie, so I don't have a ton to add, except that students bring a lot of current events into the classroom without you having to do anything, which is fantastic. Bet, please go ahead.
Since we were talking a little bit about online teaching in this particular day and age, I just wanted to emphasize the number of resources online for showing your students material culture in a way that you maybe could not have done in a physical classroom. So there are 3D models available through SketchUp that are available from sources such as the British Museum, the Met. You can do museum walkthroughs, but you can also do things like virtual exhibition tours. But I think it's really important that a lot of the things that have been done for things, for exhibitions such as Gods in Color, which has been on tour for about 13 years now and will finally settle in Copenhagen, I think, where people have already done the work of putting color back into these white marble exhibitions and making them available for people to understand how they actually would have been visualized by putting them back on the Parthenon in their sort of very garish colorations. Obviously, there are a lot of different ways to bring these kind of multimedia experiences to your students. And this is something I'm doing in my own doctorate, is trying to put together the Greco-Roman statues with the other kinds of ancient materials they were displayed with, Egyptian, Germanic, West African, whatever would have been in the space originally, trying to get your students to think about these sort of social interchanges and the way that people didn't view these objects, especially the white statues, in isolation. And I think that if you're not talking about material culture as a counterbalance to these texts, a lot of which have been written by great white males following the great white male narrative, you are doing your students a disservice, but you're also not being honest with yourself about the bias inherent in the sources that you're using. For example, Basil Gildersleeve, whose dictionary we still use in Latin courses throughout the world, also wrote The Creed of the Old South. So that may give you some idea of his perspective on racial issues and how that may affect the way that he talks about non-Greeks and Latins and about Greeks and Latins in the ancient world. So when you're talking about these sources, your students need to know that you've thought about them before you read them. Your students need to hear the background of the people that they're reading before you read the sources. After the fact, you've already done the damage.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think a lot of us probably address Aristotle and natural slavery in these kinds of classes. I know that I do. So yeah, coming to grips with that tradition is really important. I totally agree. Nisha, did you want to talk a bit too about some of the online stuff?
Yeah, I think we might, since we touched on it, it's better just to kind of do it all together. And I think, Maggie, those are some really fantastic ideas for getting people engaged online. And the trouble is, it's just so much harder, right? It's harder to teach online, and it's especially hard to teach subjects which people are going to be uncomfortable in online. And that, as I said earlier, that them being uncomfortable and you being uncomfortable is part of the point of us doing these subjects at all. So it's really difficult to know where that line is between uncomfortable, where you need to go, and breaking that bond of trust which you should have with your students. And I don't know, the only thing that I could say there was the importance of building those relationships again. If there's one thing that I think we can do as instructors, it's one-on-one meetings or one-on-one communications beforehand with each and every single student. If you've not met them in person, it is worth reaching out to them by email, trying to set up a Zoom one-to-one 15-minute conversation with them, just to develop some kind of rapport before you throw that student into the classroom and expect them to perform in front of their peers. And the problem with that is that's your time. And for people like you, Maggie, that's adjunct time, which you may not be paid for. For the rest of us who are fortunate enough to have positions, that's time when we're probably overworked, where we're supposed to do 15 other things as well. And so that comes at cost to you, but I think that's something that we have, that is one of the prices I think we should all have to pay, that time to get to know our students and build that relationship before. So that is the one thing that I would say about this kind of online COVID remote teaching, is that it's going to take more time from us to build those relationships. And I think it's got to be one-on-one at the start to get it off to a decent footing. Oh, and if there's actually something else which, sorry, the light just keeps flickering on and off here. There's something else which actually I found works in classrooms, and I think it might work online better as well, is starting with, when we're talking about ancient racializations, is starting with ancient racializations of northern people. Weird northerners with their weird milky white skin color and their strangely textured hair. And that seems to be something that a greater proportion of students can get on board with, the racialization of whiteness, even though it is not whiteness. And that's somehow easier to start with than other types of racialization, I've just found myself.
Great. There's a question from Katrine for Patricia about the Monument Lab field trip work and how this is something that can be done in undergrad classrooms. I suppose also, what about now?
That's a really great question, and thank you for plugging that, Katrine. So as Dimitri mentioned, I am an assistant curator at Monument Lab, which is a studio based in Philadelphia, but we're really concerned about public art and public history and the ways in which the narratives that we're taught in class by canons do and do not show up in public spaces, and what that means for our world today. And it's interesting that I am the only ancient art historian archaeologist on the team, but I think it has its benefits in other ways. And of course, this topic is really important in the United States and in the UK because of all of the monuments and public statues that are coming down. And one question that we had that I don't know was about the limitations and traps of our sort of discipline and the ways in which we teach. And I think that all of us, my colleagues, have answered that question in various ways throughout the past hour, or in the last hour, excuse me. But I think, and I promise I'll get to Katrine's question, but I think when we talk about kind of survey introductory courses, a lot of us still use Western civs, and sometimes you can change the title, sometimes you can't. Sometimes even when it's not in the title, it's implied in different ways that you're talking about this concept of the West and whiteness, and that absolutely informs our monumental landscapes, but it also impacts the kinds of monuments and art objects that the canon has chosen as something that our students must know because it is so illustrative of the West. And so I think unpacking what the West is not only through discourse and class discussion, but at Monument Lab, we co-created this educational resource that's appropriate for all students of all ages. And I've actually, I think this is in our show notes resource for my course on women in public art. Last semester, I had my students, in addition to sort of thinking about ancient sources and material culture, also have as part of their final project a sort of speculative monument proposal, right? So now that we've learned about different sort of gender identities or racialized ethnic identities in the ancient world, what kinds of monuments would you like to envision for the city of New York, which is where we're based? And I find that activity to be really useful because it not only shows or kind of reaffirms what we would call diversity, right, or complexity and nuance of the ancient Mediterranean and Middle East and so on, but it also helps students really understand how these modes of study and methods of study and even the labels that we use come into being, and how we can push back on that through this sort of speculative monument proposal. And the Monument Lab, field trip worksheet, I think is a really good guide that can help you, that you can integrate in your classes. I think it's a really great exercise that you can assign to your students, especially during COVID, because resources to library and sort of libraries and there was a lot of conversation on my end about how we need to rethink projects in the age of COVID, and I think that is the case. So thanks for asking that, Katrine. And should I just carry on with answering that question about limitations? Because I have one more thing that I wanted to say. Should I just do that?
Yeah, I think that's where we have to go next.
Excellent. So I mentioned, I want to just acknowledge again the work that everyone's been doing and say that I think survey classes are definitely more difficult. And in addition to Linny's syllabus, I know Katrine has also really amazing syllabus on everyday Orientalism, and I encourage you to check that out as well. But one thing that I noticed that's been coming up throughout our conversation are the limitations of our qualifiers and the limitations of our terms, right? That our discipline has somehow constructed and employed terms that describe both racial and ethnic identities, as well as like style and pots and time periods even. And so, not that is necessarily inherently bad, but I think that there are ways in which if we're not careful to have those discussions with our students or explain right, to our students what those mean, that it limits sort of the dynamic, complex approach to studying identity formations in the past, right? So something that I've done in my classes really whenever the term Greek or Egyptian comes up, or Roman, whatever, right? I always sort of stop to ask my students, what do you think that qualifier means within this particular context? And I find that, especially with this new generation, Gen Z, that they're so much more awesomely attuned to the ways in which various vectors of identity, not just race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, class even, really shape livelihoods, experiences, as well as material culture, art, and so on. And so I think, yes, do not expect, as Nisha said, don't expect them to give that up, right, themselves in class. However, I think there's a way to structure courses by being very specific with our terms that kind of encourages students to think about the field as a whole, but also how it is that we have developed these methods in art history and archaeology. And finally, I think Maggie's talked about this a little bit. It goes for our terms of race and ethnicity. What does that actually mean? There's so many coexisting various ways of approaching those terms in the present, not least in the ancient world. So I think as a course, right, at the beginning of your semester or quarter, it's important to, frankly, if you want to do this, I think you should, I try to do this at least, is to come up with a sort of agreed upon language, acknowledging that this might change in different circumstances, that is capacious and specific and self-reflexive, so that you're always conscious of the words that you're using, I guess. And I want to say that in addition to sort of Omi and Winant and Geraldine Hang and all the really amazing authors and scholars that everyone else has mentioned, I really try to assign women of color feminists and Black feminists in my courses because, which admittedly come from different fields like sociology that have, different kinds of data sets. So you can't necessarily transpose the same methods, but they do offer great questions and provocative frameworks that I think at the end of the day, push forward the field as well as our teaching because they expand and widen the canon just a little bit to be more inclusive. And I'll just stop there because it's it's 127. So.
Please go ahead.
Okay, just very briefly. I wanted to add that there are ways, especially when you have access to digital resources online, et cetera, to demonstrate to your students the interconnectivity of the ancient world, which can do a lot to explain how ancient people felt or didn't feel about race, but can also do a lot to sort of destroy this narrative of like only glorious Greco-Roman peoples had any accomplishments. And the first is these sort of changing timeline video montages that show you like how long Egyptian civilization and how long certain ancient Han civilizations were going as these other civilizations are rising and falling. And the second is overlapping maps, territorial maps, again, with these video montages. I'll try to find some to add to the linked resources, but essentially trying to to show that people groups were constantly in movement, that people were constantly changing their territories, and that reflects the movement of actual humans who interacted with each other, and that there weren't these sort of built barriers in the way that we think, okay, this is Italy, and then it stops. That there are multiple people groups, even within Italy, is something that I think a lot of people don't talk about when talking about the ancient world. So yeah, basically trying to break down this idea of the long past as a static enterprise, in the same way that we need to do the same, as I was talking about before, with our perception of Africa and the way that we teach it. So yeah, just getting your students to think about how much has happened in the last 4 years versus, okay, this is a period of 100 years, and we talk about it as though it's one stable thing, that because there was no email and people couldn't communicate as rapidly, like nothing changed or happened. Art remains the same all the way through, politics remains the same all the way through. So if you get your students to look through the lens of modern, like contemporary history, and apply that lens to the ancient world, to think about how rapidly things were changing with technological advances, with the movement of peoples, with armies and objects. Like, this is where material culture can really come in handy, is to show the similarities and the differences throughout the Mediterranean and further afield, in a way that's cheap and efficient.
Yeah, those are all great suggestions. Thanks, Bet. That's wonderful. Yeah, it occurred to me that so much of what we end up trying to fight are these simple narratives that are that we've inherited, that our students have inherited, right? I think a lot of our students, if they encounter the ancient Greek or Roman world, Egypt, ancient Near East, they often encounter at the beginning of a kind of European history class, so that these are all seen as kind of, yeah, you know, the passing of a torch that ends up in Western Europe and the United States. And I think fortunately our students are very critical thinkers about these kinds of narratives, and are willing to entertain different types of narratives. At least that's been my experience. We're about out of time. It's 11. Well, here in the Mountain West, it's 11:31. It's 1:30 in New York City. I think we should probably end it here, if that's okay with everybody. I really want to thank the panelists for an amazing discussion. Really, all of you were just great. And I hope that we can continue to have a conversation moving forward. I hope that these webinars really are just the first step, both in conversation, but also in practice. I think Bet very appropriately reminded us that this is only a small piece of all of the work that needs to happen. And that if all we do is talk, then we're not really accomplishing all that much at all. So yeah, on behalf of all the attendees, I'd like to thank all of you for your contributions. I think it's been amazing. And I hope that we can pick this up in the future.